When I first got into FPS games, my aim was terrible. I tried Apex and I would hot drop just to die over and over again. That's when I discovered aim trainers like Kovaaks and aimlab, which seemed great, but it was just a bunch of different scenarios and no clear direction on how to improve properly. That's why I made this channel, and ultimately this crash course to help people learn how to aim as fast as possible, because no one wants to train to play a video game. So far, thousands of people have benefited from my content, and hopefully you can too. If you're brand new, make sure to check out the beginning of this playlist, but also stick around for some Q&A. All right, as per usual, we're going to be going through the comments top to bottom from my last video, which is evasive switching, and make sure to watch through this whole thing, especially if you're newer to intermediate, because I've found that a lot of people have the same types of questions in the community. I'm often answering the same questions. So chances are somebody's asking something here that you've probably wanted to ask yourself, and I'm going to talk through it. First one, regarding sensitivity and FOV, how would you go about adjusting them when practicing a combination of different aim techniques in a one-by-one fashion? Yeah, so like if you're thinking about changing from like 103 to 115 FOV, target switching, or changing the walls, for example, to be from pure color to like having lines if you're going static versus tracking, what I do, and I notice a lot of people do this, is they'll just keep, you know, suboptimal settings for specific scenarios, because it just doesn't make sense to just constantly be changing your settings around. If it's a chore to do the training, you're much less likely to do it. So do whatever keeps you engaged and interested, even if it's suboptimal. Using lapu visuals, you recommend it's a good overall visual to use. I just use it because I think they're cool looking. I don't think it's optimal, honestly. Would you recommend training the techniques in the order you presented them and adding them into your routine one by one, or is there a better way to work your way up to more complex techniques? What I usually recommend to people is to consciously think about one thing and notice one thing while you're training, to try to fix or improve on. And the reason why I say the one thing is because, one, it helps you cue your attention to something that you need to improve, which is required for improvement for like your neural pathways to get established as you're learning skills. So, and it helps you be engaged. So you're actively thinking about your training, and you're not just kind of like passively performing the situations. But the other thing is, you don't want to overwhelm yourself with too many inputs. Like if you're trying to coordinate 5 different things that you're trying to improve at the same time, you're going to do those 5 things poorly. So focusing on one thing, even if you're advanced and you're able to focus on more things, at least one will kind of set some kind of automatic response that you can always train, and just focus more on training and less on how you're training. And then lastly, I would say that over time, like you're going to be leveling up on the different techniques, and you're going to hit like diminishing returns. So it's not like you just fully fill one circle and then you move on to another circle and you move on to another circle. Like if you're thinking of the techniques as, you know, leveling up in like an RPG character or something, like it's going to be a progressive loop of continuous improvement. Now that I'm so close to finishing this series, what's next for the channel? So I have a huge backlog, and I think I'm going to be focusing a lot more on like shorter videos and pumping out more regular content. Hopefully I can retain an editor that can help me build the channel more long term. So we'll see how that goes. You make a guide about mouse grips, like claw grip versus fingertip grip. I'd say there's a lot of information about that already. And grip is one of those things where I personally feel like as long as you're not doing something that's leading to long-term like physical negative effects, there are some perceived advantages and disadvantages to different grip types, but it's also like min-maxing at that point. I think it's way more important just to kind of like do something that's comfortable for you and just stick with it, you know, and focus more on the outcomes while you're training rather than how you're like physically holding the mouse. One thing that stuck with me is when you mentioned shaky aiming, how many people blame their mouse control rather than reading skills. So how do you distinguish between the two? So the first thing that I would say is, that's a great question, by the way, but the first thing I would say is if you're following a bot that doesn't require a lot of reading, like in other words, it's on one plane only, like it's only moving horizontally or vertically, and it very rarely changes direction, and like you're having trouble staying on the bot, like you have a lot of jitter, that's a dead set indicator that you are experiencing shakiness with your performance, and it's not due to reading. If in particular you're dealing with bots that have a mixture of strafe patterns, like they switch from like longer to like short strafes, and then when they're on the longer pattern, you start to kind of pull your mouse away while they're continuing on with a long strafe, that's basically what's happening. Is that's due to your reading skills, and that's your brain like assuming that they're going to switch direction again because they just did a bunch of short strafes and then they mix in a long strafe. So that's kind of like the two extremes, I would say. Reactive heavy tracking, I actually perform well, but when it comes to more precise aiming, I struggle trying to correct onto the bot. And I would say that that's not terribly uncommon. Like somebody might have really good reading skills depending on the type of game that they're playing. Like if they're playing something with a longer TTK, with a lot of movement, or like an arena shooter, you might have very good reading skills and you might kind of crutch that a little bit. I'd say it's less common because a lot more people tend to play like TAC FPS type games. But in that case, you would struggle kind of with more precise clicking, especially like dynamic clicking, because the reading isn't the same. And you're probably going to have less mouse control, particularly around kind of like fingertip aim. So if you're playing something like raw mouse control, reload, you're playing like TMTS, you're playing smaller pasus, like those you're gonna struggle with for sure. That's typical, I would say, because you just haven't invested as much time in those types of scenarios. And you'll even find among the top players, among the top aimers, like we were just watching the aimlab tournament, like people that are really good at clicking, like there's somebody who's going to be really good at more like reactive tracking scenarios that at the top levels, you can't really be amazing at all those situations because they're different components of aim are involved. When it comes to target switching, are we fast flick and micro correction or slower controlled line to the target? So I use the term criterion. So the correct movement essentially is going to be on the faster side for sure. Generally, if you do a slow, like super slow controlled line, it's not going to be the same movement. Like if you're in an FPS game and you have a full clip, you know, you got 28 bullets in the mag and you're aiming at somebody on one side of the screen and they're almost dead. So you do maybe like half your clip to kill them. And then there's somebody on the other side of your screen. You have to immediately snap over to them with the same bullets in the same clip without reloading and with losing as few bullets in the process, because you want to maximize damage to both of your targets. That's the type of situation that you would be encountering where flick target switching is extremely meaningful. It can mean the difference between winning a fight and losing a fight. So that's why I think it's so important that you train in that methodology, right? Like, because that's the movement that you're trying to get better at. Can you please make a video on how to make your practice more efficient? That's really high up next in the backlog, so look out for that. How do you get the kovaak enemies to have the glowing effects? So I'm gonna make a short video on this. I keep saying that, but I need to just make a video that I can point to people. Be like, here you go. Regarding your point of technique versus speed, I really like regen scenarios for this specific reason. You really can't go fast if your technique is not on point. Yeah, exactly. And actually something that I've seen recently is shrink target switching. And what happens is when you click to the bot and you start to do damage to it, it's like a big bot, but then it immediately shrinks down. Like it goes away from you and goes to like a very small, precise dot instantly, almost. And that's really cool because it forces you to put your crosshair like more in the center of the bot when you flick to it. So it kind of forces you to develop good technique. So I think that's really gonna start to show up as being a great scenario type. Rid, should the arm be tense or relaxed? Generally, you want to relax your arm, shoulder, wrist, fingers as much as possible. That being said, it is impossible to avoid. This is something that comes up a lot. People are like, I am being tense. Like a little bit of tension, like I can't completely avoid tension. And that's the point that I want to make, is one of the main reasons why we're investing so much time in minimizing tension is for endurance purposes, because when you are tense, you are activating the muscles in your arm. It can lead to long-term health effects, like getting tendonitis, for example, and then you're out of commission. And also because you only have so much reserves of tension. That's how Seba kind of puts it. He's a really good reactive tracker in Rivasect. And Like you want to save up your tension when it's required, you know, and make sure that you can use it when it's there, when you need it. So that's why you kind of want to avoid being tense as much as possible so that when you do have to be tense, you can be tense. Will you create a video on developing a healthy lifestyle to optimize learning and training? Yeah, that's in my backlog as well. Like schedule, lifestyle, exercise, you know, stuff like that. It's not going to be like a detailed like weight training guide, but more of like, here's the minimum environmental things that I would suggest that you get in the habit of doing in order to maximize your learning environment, essentially. So this question was interesting. I've been playing Apex Legends and I'm on console. I switched to PC aim assist and I want to improve my tracking, but whatever I do, I just can't improve. Yeah, this is like a difficult subject because there's really not a lot of evidence and there's not a lot of use cases. I even did a poll on this to see how many people who watch my videos are on controller or use mouse and keyboard and controller maybe, and it was like 98% said mouse and keyboard only. So there's just not a lot of people practicing controller aim training. There's not a lot of evidence that it works. So, I mean, just on its surface, like just without even looking at scientific evidence or doing any research on it, like your range of motion is vastly limited with a controller. There's certainly some people that can do really cool stuff with controllers, don't get me wrong, but you know, you just have like your thumbs and your hands, like, and you could definitely do some cool stuff even with that limited amount of input that you have, but it's just not anywhere close to what you have available to you with a mouse. So it's just really tough to know whether or not that's meaningful and worth training. Type of gaming mouse you use? I use a G Pro wireless super light. Would popcorn or pasu be better for sniping in games or maybe something else? Yeah, I think dynamic clicking in general is pretty representative of sniping situations. And the reason why I think dynamic is because, I mean, static is obviously if somebody's sitting still, but in video games, it's more likely that people are going to be moving around, and it kind of raises the bar and the difficulty a little bit. Like once you get a certain amount of static, like you get the fundamentals of the static, then you get, I think, far more diminishing returns in investing in that skill as it applies to FPS games specifically. I mean, it does help you build controlled speed, which can be useful in video games. Like it can mean the difference between winning and losing if you're literally faster at moving your mouse than somebody else, but it's less important. Can you make a solid free course list? I have a lot of course lists, so I asked for elaboration, but I never got elaboration. I mean, this is an aim training crash course, and I have a bunch of routines associated. Tips for shotguns in Apex. I actually have a video on this. One of the key things that helps when you're first learning to use shotguns is to kind of slightly trail behind the target with your shotgun, like aimed. And when the target is going to move back into your crosshair, essentially, like you see them start to decelerate, that means they're going to shift their momentum back the other direction, and that's when you shoot. That's basically when they are the most viable, because they're kind of like sitting still for a moment in time, and it gets you in the habit of like understanding when people are going to change directions and like what the optimal time to shoot them is. How would you like it if you were the ball that got skipped and left alone? The lonely little target. Hey, Raspberry's here. So only one comment on this community post. So thoughts on mobile FPS. I think generically the industry is going to have to come to Jesus on how they want to approach the mixed input FPS, like competitive scene, even like the casual scene. To me, like as somebody who works in the software industry a little bit, what we're seeing now with all of the different cross-platform, you know, like Apex is on Switch, it's on Xbox, it's on PS4, it's on PC, and they let, to a degree, you know, mixed lobbies, and that's not unusual. You know, Fortnite, I think, was the first big FPS to really do that. I think it's a byproduct of like maximizing your audience. Like if you know that you have all of these different stable platforms, it makes a lot of sense to release your product in a way that it's compatible with any one of those platforms, right? So that was like priority number one as like a software development team, because then you maximize your user base, right? And you get a lot of people that could potentially buy your MTX, right? So it's a money related decision. It makes a lot of sense. Like if you're a business, you're in the business to make profit, like you want to maximize your profits. So that's all well and good. But now we're running into situations where they're having to specifically modify their game weighted to give, you know, different inputs specific advantages just so that they can compete in the same lobbies, because you're dealing with multiple different types of inputs. I mean, there's no feasible way to balance those inputs. Adding another dimension on that with the mobile FPS, I think it's only going to continue to grow. Like, I think we're going to get better connectivity everywhere globally around the world. Like, you're going to have always on type, you know, internet connections that are going to get cheaper and faster. You're going to have more of the, you know, edge type devices. So not being stuck and rooted in with like a PC, for example, or even a console. You're more on the go. You're going to see more things like Stream Deck, you know, for example. So it's only going to keep growing. And I think the industry overall is going to have to make a call on how they want to approach separating all these different types of inputs to allow fairness across, you know, the entire platform, because it is going to start to hurt them, I think, if they continue on the trajectory of just optimizing for getting the most money out of the largest user base and instead optimizing for, you know, gameplay, like good feeling gameplay. And I think there's going to be a good amount of competition that starts to rise from game developers who prioritize that like above all else, you know, the pureness of the gameplay experience. And people are going to be attracted to that because they're tired of all of these battle royale type shooters. So that's kind of like my long protracted view of mobile FPS, but set in the greater context of like where FPS games are going, I think, and like where technology is taking FPS games. That's it as usual. If you like my content, make sure to like, subscribe. And if you are interested in any of the tiers that you can get through the YouTube memberships, I'm starting to really kind of grow a knowledge base of other like VOD reviews and routines that I make for people, so you can benefit from that as well. And it's not just what I specifically do for you. So make sure you check those out. And reactive tracking is going to be next. Super excited for that one. We got something very special in store for that. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks.